Soon. Welcome everybody to this third lecture now or seminar on AUKUS and its discontents. I'm really pleased today to welcome Dr. Sian Troath, who's joining us from the ANU. Before we begin, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, and Monash campuses are scattered around Victoria. The Kulin Nation is a collective of 5 Aboriginal groups: the Wurundjeri, Bunurong, the Wathaurong, Tuangaron, and Dja Wurrung. And today I'm actually located in the land of the Bunurong people. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and any Indigenous and First Nations people joining us today. As I said, this is our third seminar. We're joined by an emerging scholar or an early career research scholar, Dr. Sian Troath, who's currently a research fellow at the Australian National University. Sian's expertise is in Australian defence policy, and she's particularly interested in the politics of emerging defence technology. I'm really excited to hear from you today, Sian. I'm going to hand the floor over to you. You'll give us a presentation and you'll speak about your research and your interests. And then what we'll do is we'll open up the floor to questions. To people in the audience, you can write down your questions as you go or any comments, and I will read them out, and I may invite some of you. I think the way that this webinar has been set up, I may have to read the questions out loud, but we'll see how it goes. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to do this. It's been a really good opportunity to start to put together some of my otherwise disparate thoughts about AUKUS into something a bit more coherent, I hope. First of all, I'd just like to apologize that I was a bit sick last week, so I'm just on the tail end of a cold. So if I start coughing, I'm really sorry about that. I'm not sure how talking for so long is going to go, but hopefully we'll be okay. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is kind of a two-part talk on AUKUS. So in the first half, what I want to focus on is what I think is sustaining AUKUS, why I think it is developing in the way that it does. And this will be through looking at what interests are involved and the kind of political economy that sits behind AUKUS. And in the second half, I want to put it in its broader alliance context. And this is where I will argue that if you are starting from a starting point that you are concerned about Australia's ties to the US, then AUKUS is actually the least of our worries compared to Australia's broader ties to the US, particularly the militarization of the North. And I think AUKUS is in some ways distracting from this bigger picture. And I'll go through why this is the case for New Zealand as well, because I think the comparison is quite interesting. So I kind of assume at this point everyone is probably familiar with AUKUS at this point, particularly if you're looking into a seminar about it. But Pillar 1 is broadly the plan for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines in collaboration with the US and the UK. And Pillar 2 is about the plan for advanced technology cooperation. So Pillar 1 of AUKUS is in a lot of ways easier to grasp. It's also easier to contest. It has a clear goal. There's a bit more transparency around the developments taking place, and the problems with it have been really clearly outlined from the outset, including the cost, their contribution to further militarization of the region, the impacts on non-proliferation norms and nuclear waste management, among other issues. Pillar 2 is a lot more opaque and kind of harder to pin down. Broadly speaking, it is both a desire to integrate the defence industrial bases of these 3 states more closely together, and to also cooperate on pursuing new and emerging military technologies. So the kinds of technologies we're talking about here are things like AI, cyber capabilities, quantum technologies, autonomous systems, and electronic warfare. Not a huge amount has been publicised about what has been happening under AUKUS Pillar 2 at this stage. So we know there has been a small amount of cooperation. Things like in 2023, the UK hosted the US and Australia for an AI and autonomy trial. There's been a trial of autonomous vehicles in Australia. There's collaboration on development of a deep space advanced radar. And late last year, there were also joint demonstrations of autonomous systems during exercise Autonomous Warrior 2024.
I'm
And
so
one of the ways,
sorry, Sean. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It doesn't look like your slides are moving. Were you moving the slides?
oh, no, not yet.
Okay, good. Sorry.
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 Thank
Thank
you. And so to pin down how AUKUS, particularly Pillar 2, is developing, where it might be likely to develop, and kind of understand the trends, we can look more broadly at Australia's pursuit of advanced military technologies and the underlying rationale driving AUKUS forward, as well as the US alliance more broadly. And this then gives us a little bit more insight into who the key actors might be and the ideologies which drive the pursuit of these technologies. I think it's helpful as a starting point to go back to the beginning and to look at how AUKUS was justified at the outset and how that justification has developed over time. Because one thing that really stands out when you go back and you look at the early announcements around AUKUS is that there was very little information about what it was for in a big picture sense. So there was no real explanation of how would either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 contribute to any form of grand strategy of the states pursuing it, or their ability to either be or feel secure. So the original statement announcing AUKUS, it lays out the circumstances the three states saw as being pertinent to its emergence. So they focused on the idea of greater security challenges, military modernization, and a narrowing technological advantage. And AUKUS was described as, to quote them, an historic opportunity to protect shared values and promote security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. There was a lot of focus on nuclear submarines as being technologically superior, particularly given how long they can remain submerged. But then what the announcement really does lack is that strategic rationale, the kind of the so what, why do we need technologically superior submarines? What will they be used for? How will they ensure security? And kind of any understanding of what security might mean. Over time, you saw justifications expand a little, not necessarily a lot, but it's important to note that those justifications are post hoc justifications to fill what was a pre-existing vacuum. It's fairly clear that a well-defined strategy was not a driving force at the outset, and a lot of attempts to fit strategy in after the fact simply treat it as a kind of general solution to all security and some economic problems that the states are facing. It's usually justified with relatively vague concepts as well, things like countering or competing with China, maintaining a rules-based order, or cooperating with like-minded allies. At the more laughable end of justifications, it's been described as something able to maintain a world that protects freedom and respects human rights, the rule of law, the independence of sovereign states, and the rules-based international order. That was how one joint leader's statement described it. The closest we get to a strategic rationale for AUKUS is various forms of talking about the idea of deterrence. So Labour MP Luke Gosling, for instance, has outlined his thinking in an opinion piece and in a kind of companion academic journal article as well. So he argues the purpose of the submarines is what he calls their strategic effect, which allows Australia to be able to enter the deterrence game in earnest. He makes it clear as well that AUKUS is a response to Chinese military modernization, particularly in the naval domain. He sees the submarines as sitting within a broader balance of submarines favourable to the US allies and partners when compared with China's capabilities. The role of the rest of Australian statecraft is then to ensure that that deterrence is believable in his thinking. But at the same time, he acknowledges that the long timeline of the project means that submarines should also be, to quote him, a country agnostic capability that can respond along a broad spectrum of contingencies ranging from great power war to insidious grey zone threats. So this is a broad description, and deterrence is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. And even at its most fleshed out, it is something which is reliant on Australia being part of a collection of allies, which notably includes the United States. So if those balancing equations don't then hold without the US, even if you accept the logic, it's not really an accurate reflection of reality. And the US is now arguably a significant threat to Australia, and certainly even the most avowed alliance supporters must concede a high degree of uncertainty about the interest of the US in supporting Australia or what the US is going to do in the world in general. And so in this context, how is it that having technologically superior submarines will contribute to protecting Australian values, security, or prosperity, as proponents argue that it will? So what specifically are the submarines for? Why are the submarines that can stay submerged longer? more appropriate to the tasks that Australia would use submarines for? Given the cost, the risks, and the timeline of the project, how does it connect more broadly to Australia's engagement with the world? And then even these are narrow questions because it's a project that can be debated in quite narrow terms. So is it worth it compared to other defence capabilities, for instance, or in quite broad terms, such as whether a militarised defence of a US-led global order is good for human security or Australian security at all. So then if it's not strategy, which is driving AUKUS, what is it? And so I think there are a few different pieces to understanding where AUKUS came from and then how it has developed over time. So first, there is this kind of instinctive clutching of the Anglosphere that drove the creation of the agreement in the first place. This is something that relates to how Australia sees its place in the world, which is still, after centuries, as a lost Anglo outpost in Asian geography. The sense of isolation, the fear of abandonment, as long argued by Alan Gingell, and the threat perception remains strong in the minds of Australia's policymakers. And this is part of the reason that Australian governments have tied themselves closer and closer to the US in recent years, increasing reliance on the US and granting greater access to Australian territory. It's the need politicians feel to simply give the US what James Curran has described as more strategic gifts in the hopes that it will provide security guarantees and continuing access to intelligence and defence technologies remains, even in the context of the second Trump administration. Both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton suggested carving out favourable critical minerals concessions to the US in exchange for exemptions to the initial tariff policy. And I think this demonstrates the kind of sheer desperation to hold on to the US alliance tighter and tighter. And we can think of this in part as what's been called the ontological security component. So Morgan Rees has argued that the US alliance and the fear of abandonment have become deeply ingrained aspects of Australia's self-identity, to the point that the potential abdication of the US from its position as a regional great power has become a source of prospective shame and anxiety. So the idea of ontological security focuses on how states view themselves and how they wish to be seen by others, and the impact that these things have on foreign policy decisions. But while identity and self-perception definitely do play a role here, they are far from the dominant or the only factor. Beyond those, I think we also have to consider the way in which material interests have been attached to the alliance and to AUKUS. So it's not only that the alliance and the role of the US is seen as essential to Australia's identity and interests, but also that key individuals then come to have a material stake in perpetuating this particular view of the world and Australia's place in it. So one component of this, for example, is the role of what Vince Scapatura has called the US lobby in Australia. So he focused on the Australia-America leadership dialogue, and he uses that to look at the role of the US lobby in socialising Australian politicians into becoming flag bearers for the alliance. So Australian politicians established their credentials as serious and competent politicians, in part through their avowed support of the US alliance. So it's this more than a sense of shame that is argued to accompany a failure to maintain the kind of identity vested nature of the alliance, which keeps Australian political figures tied to the US far beyond any rational calculation could justify. And it's also material interests, which then help to explain why so many individuals and organisations beyond politicians jumped on the AUKUS train before it had even left the station. So despite the obvious and the well-canvassed problems with AUKUS from the outset, it has received a wide degree of support from a variety of sectors. And this is because there are people who saw economic opportunities to be gained from the agreement, or perhaps because they're thinking about Australia's security aligned with the kind of ontological view that I described above, or a combination of the two. And one important context for the material economic interests, is what Tricia Wijaya and Kanishka Jayasuriya have termed militarised neoliberalism. In broad terms, this just means the increasingly overlapping nature of economic and security imperatives. And so when it comes to the context of AUKUS, what this means is that we have to analyse the social relations underpinning the agreement. So in the words of Tricia Wijaya and Ali Hayes, who wrote a piece on militarised neoliberalism as applied to AUKUS specifically, AUKUS exists within a system of market coordination that is now linked to security institutions and to specific alliances. Central to this is bipartisanship among AUKUS partner countries, through which a particular kind of social relations has been condensed, one which creates new winners and losers. We observe the reconciling of two otherwise competing political groups or factions, such as Democrats and Republicans or Labour and Liberal, to provide a particular market route for certain industry and business groups. These groups include civilian-run enterprises, defence contractors, state-owned enterprises, and emerging tech startups. And so then we can start looking at what interest groups are actually benefiting from AUKUS, and who sees a benefit to be had from AUKUS. So one example of this has been critical minerals producers. The US and Australia have, because of AUKUS, started, or like under the auspices of AUKUS, started deepening their critical minerals ties, which has resulted in new funding sources and changes to regulation in order to make this happen. Pillar 2 of AUKUS has also opened up space for Silicon Valley and venture capital to play an increasingly prominent role as well. In the US, companies such as Palantir and Anduril are challenging the traditional defense firms, and venture capital firms such as Andreessen Horowitz are turning their attention to defense startups. And these are trends that were already underway, but carry with them new implications given the enhanced power of key Silicon Valley figures in the second Trump administration. So another manifestation of how interests have been kind of embedded in AUKUS and are involved in sustaining it is the growing closeness between military, civilian, and defense industry and academia. And this is something I've called the military-industrial academic complex. Prior to the announcement of AUKUS, there had already been increasingly close ties formed between universities, defense industry, civilian industry, and academia. This was driven in part by changing economic incentives and needs. So the three groups have all seen value in pursuing relationships with one another to advance their respective interests. So the idea of the military-industrial complex is obviously not a new one, either globally or in Australia. It's a term that was first coined by Eisenhower in the 1950s. He referred to it as the military-industrial complex, but interestingly, he did originally consider using the term military-industrial academic complex. And although he ditched the academic, which does make it less of a mouthful, in his famous speech where he talked about the issue, he did talk about the role of universities as well. And this was because in the US in the 50s and 60s, government defense funding was making up an increasing proportion of the funding available for university research. And this led Eisenhower to warn that the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. I think we can see a similar thing happening today as well. So different people over time working on these ideas have added different groups to the military-industrial complex. This has included things like think tanks or the media or the entertainment industry, and this has led Nick Turse, who works in this area, to simply call it the complex for short for this very reason. I'm focusing here mainly on universities because I find them interesting, and I think the politics of expertise involved is fascinating. Academia is often used to give a certain sense of credibility and expertise backing to certain ideas, and this can be true of foreign and defense policy as well. And when it came to looking then at what is sustaining militarism in Australia, it became clear that universities are an essential part of the picture. And again, this isn't something that is new, but there have been noticeable changes in recent years. And I would argue particularly since 2016 or so. It was around this point that there were some shake-ups to defence industry policy by the government. And this included that the Minister for Defence Industry at the time announced that announced that they had the goal for Australia to become one of the world's top 10 defence exporters. And so while in some senses there was strategic thinking behind these policies, in that they were responding to how they perceive Australia's strategic environment, a considerable part of the motivation here is also economic. So this plan was tied to their desire to renew Australian manufacturing. And this desire to kind of link strategic and economic policy in this way for the renewal of manufacturing is something which has only increased under the Labor government. Various government plans that were released around 2016, 2017 do point to this dual strategic economic vision for Australia's defence industry. And at the same time, they make the case for creating these closer relationships between industry, academia, and defence in order to achieve it. And so you can look through examples of this from across industry, academia, and defence, and you can see the value that the three groups place on working together and what they hope to achieve out of it. So for defence, for example, one key factor in this changing relationship between these groups was the role of the Defence Science Technology Group, which is the research and development arm of Australian Defence. And under the leadership of firstly Alex Zelinsky and second Tanya Munro, they played a big role in kind of changing the focus to academia and to also local industry as well. So Zelinsky played a big role in opening up DSTG and the Department of Defence to the higher education sector, while at the same time pushing for these closer ties to local defence industry as well. Upon leaving DSTG, Zelinsky then took on the position of Vice-Chancellor at Newcastle University, so he continues to push for these relationships from a different point in this triangular relationship now. And then following him, his successor, Tanya Munro, came into the role at DSTG from a university background. So again, you can see these links being sustained. And like Zelinsky, she also made it clear she thought academia and defence could do more together and believed universities could make a substantial contribution to defence. So under her leadership, they launched the More Together Defence and Science and Technology Strategy 2030. So that outlines their view of the need to step up and coordinate a national science and technology enterprise to expand what had previously been more internal research and development and more heavily involve academia and industry. Universities are seen as such a resource for defence that the Defence Transformation Strategy points to the impact of COVID on universities as giving defence, to quote the strategy, an opportunity to position defence research as a long-term business proposition to attract and retain experience and corporate knowledge. So defence industry then have also shown a keen interest in forging closer relationships with government and academia. So you can see this from statements of various senior leadership figures within defence industry. The managing director of BAE Systems Maritime Australia, for example, has described it as helping to achieve what he calls an accelerator effect. The managing director of the Australian arm of Elbit Systems has talked about how their partnerships with the universities have enabled the company's defence technology to remain cutting edge. And it's easy to find comments from various other senior defence industry figures and from the big primes outlining the importance they place on both academia and on local defence industry relationships. It makes it clear that they see them as sources of additional R&D capacity, of resources, and ultimately profits as well. And then to turn to universities, at the same time, universities were facing funding shortages and they were increasingly turning to alternative sources for research funding. So tracing their financial relationships with defence industry is quite difficult as there is a lack of transparency around this. But what is easy to trace is the increase in government defence contracts. So you can see that here. So this on the left, it is showing the increase in the total amount of money spent from the Australian Department of Defence to Australian universities. So you can see this big spike start to happen in 2016 and 2017. And then on the right, it's just the total number of contracts rather than the amount spent. So you can see the same increase in the total number of contracts, roughly mirroring the increase in spending. And alongside this one, there's been some journalists who have tracked the US Department of Defence contracts to Australian universities, and you see the same sort of increase over the same period of time in funding going from the US Department of Defence to Australian universities. Yeah. And so the relationship between industry, defence and academia is something that you can then see in the wake of the AUKUS announcement as well. And so I'm going to focus only on universities here because it was really overt, I thought, to trace the university response to the AUKUS announcement. Universities and university bodies pretty much immediately began spruiking their credentials for contributing to AUKUS. At first, this focused predominantly on the role that universities could play in workforce training required to realise Pillar 1. So universities with existing relevant nuclear-related programs have been particularly keen to highlight their relevance to the government, particularly UNSW and ANU, for instance. Universities have set up various new programs intended to support AUKUS, such as the University of South Australia's Global Executive MBA in Defence and Space, which is intended to train senior managers of small and medium enterprises, civil servants, and senior defence personnel from the 3 AUKUS states. Universities have also formed partnerships with the US and with UK universities for AUKUS-related purposes. So there's an agreement between Flinders, Manchester, and Rhode Island University, and also UNSW, Arizona State University, and King's College London. At the same time, both Universities Australia and the Group of 8, so 2 of the peak bodies representing different groups of universities, have been arguing that universities are essential to the success of AUKUS. And you can see that in some of these quotes from the Group of 8 Chief Executive and the Universities Australia Chief Executive. So from the Group of 8, Vicky Thompson, who is the Chief Executive, argued that Group of 8 universities have significant defence capability and are therefore able to play a major role in the development of the nuclear submarine capability. She also said that defence research provides a strong foundation to turbocharging our efforts to support the AUKUS platform, and we stand ready to further support the nation's defence research effort in bringing AUKUS to successful delivery. And that one was on Pillar 2. And at the same time, Universities Australia argues that universities are central to building our defence capability and the success of security pacts such as AUKUS and the Quad arrangements. So you can see here that universities have really latched onto AUKUS as something which can provide them a way to prove their worth to the government, to try and attract more funding and resources. But that means that they are kind of implicitly or explicitly, I guess, accepting the rationale for AUKUS, and that it is something that universities must support rather than provide space to be critical of as well as provide support to. So these developments are just kind of a sample of the different ways in which universities have responded to AUKUS in ways which make it clear they see it as an economic opportunity. It makes universities one of these key interest groups that have attached themselves to AUKUS and are therefore invested in it continuing. I think this is just one example which then shows that identity is not the key driver of AUKUS, that identity is something which shaped why it emerged in the way that it did and why governments pursued it at the outset. But the thing that then keeps it alive and transforms it over time and embeds it within society and the economy is the interests that are getting attached to it over time. And these are kind of the pre-existing dynamics into which AUKUS was dropped. So it entered an environment in which these actors were all pursuing closer relationships with one another already, and in which the pursuit of advanced military technologies was a core part of those collaborations. And this is something which then created a permissive environment for AUKUS to be accepted, despite the clear problems with the arrangement. And it also meant that the immediate response for a number of actors, like we've seen with universities, was simply never let a good opportunity go to waste. And I think this is part of the reason why it is important to start by interrogating the lack of a strategic rationale at the outset, because a lot of attention due to that has been focused on asking since, what is AUKUS actually for? But I think the better question to ask now is, who is AUKUS for? So who is invested in it? Who is driving it forward? Who is shaping the way in which it develops? And this brings me to the second part of the talk, which is where I want to talk about how AUKUS is actually the least of our worries. The obvious deficiencies of AUKUS did mean that it was criticised from the outset. But in the context of the early second Trump administration, we're seeing more and more people asking to reinterrogate the agreement anew and emphasise the pre-existing criticisms. The decision to tie security fortunes to the US at this particular moment in time does seem even more foolish than usual. And it's in this context that I think focusing too much on AUKUS risks missing the forest for the trees. I'm going to show this through looking at both Australia and New Zealand. For Australia, AUKUS is only one slice of the broader Australia-US alliance. Australia has been investing itself further and further with US defense and strategic planning for some time. So James Curran has argued that the policy of alliance maintenance adopted by successive governments in Canberra involves giving the United States more and more access to Australian military facilities and territory. The consequence is that Australia is now locked into US strategy for Asia, which is to contest and contain China's rise. Similarly, the 2022 Defence Strategic Review stated that Australia's defence policy would be centred around, to quote it, an enhanced and expanded alliance with the United States. Australian MP Luke Gosling, who I talked about earlier, has described the alliance as arguably more central to Australia's strategic policy than even during the Cold War. So in his academic article, he talks about the state of the alliance as of 2023 when the article was written. And he argues that both Canberra and Washington have committed to, and more importantly, delivered on strengthening the alliance to reach levels of strategic intimacy unseen since its establishment in 1951. So for Australian governments, shaped by a particular set of security experts, in the words of Clinton Fernandez, security is not directly understood as the safety of the Australian public, but as enhancing Australia's relevance to the United States global primacy. And so at the same time then, as Australia has actively worked to tie the US more closely to Asia in the context of its long-standing fear of abandonment, the US has also been looking to disperse its capabilities in the region to reduce their vulnerability in the case of conflict with China. The Wall Street Journal dubbed this the scatter and survive strategy, and Australia is one of the locations to which the scattering has happened, alongside Japan, the Philippines, and US territories, including the Northern Mariana Islands. So the former chair of the US House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, described Australia as the central base of the Indo-Pacific to counter the China threat. The US sees Australia as divided into 3 zones. So there's the Northern Zone, which is for force protection. So this is where US Marine rotations in Darwin happen, where airbase expansions have been happening and upgrades to airfields across the north of Australia. Alongside intelligence facilities as well. The middle of Australia is a second zone, which is a potential logistics hub. And then the southern part of Australia is where industrial production and the human capital required to sustain it is seen as existing. So significant developments have been happening, particularly in this northern zone for force projection. US Marines have been rotating through Darwin since 2011. In 2022, it was announced that the US was preparing to be able to deploy up to 6 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to northern Australia. This included a plan for the US to build its own dedicated facilities at the Tyndall Air Base. It was reported that the US had committed more than $1 billion of spending to upgrading these military assets across northern Australia. So come 2024 then, tender documents obtained by Reuters showed that the US was building intelligence briefing rooms, upgrading runways, warehouses, data centers, and maintenance hangars, alongside building jet fuel storage facilities. The US is also planning wharves, runways, fuel storage, and hangars in locations including Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Australia's Cocos Islands. In 2024 and 2025, it was reported that Australia is the top overseas location for US Air Force and Navy construction spending at over $330 million. And this once again means that Australia is, as Des Ball once described it, a suitable piece of real estate for the US. Australia has also committed money here to the northern bases, including Learmonth in Western Australia, the Cocos Islands, Darwin, and the Tyndall Air Bases. While Australia will argue that these are Australian bases with US investment and cooperation, there was a telling comment from Australian Air Commodore Ron Tilley when he was speaking of these projects in Northern Australia, and he kind of said what many of us would have assumed. To quote him, "I don't believe the US would be spending all this money on our northern bases if there wasn't an arrangement in place where they could use those facilities they are funding in times of conflict." And so I think it's this militarization of Australia's north, which even more than AUKUS ties Australia to any conflict that the US decides to participate in. And we saw this, I think, when it was confirmed that Australian air bases assisted with US strikes on Yemen in October. So this included allowing access and overflight to US aircraft through Northern Australia and likely also air-to-air refueling of the aircraft involved. Alongside these facilities, at the same time, the intelligence facility in Central Australia, Pine Gap, has also been expanded. Little information is publicly available, but Richard Tanter has traced the increase in buildings through satellite imagery. So in 2022, he said the number of giant antennas had grown by more than a third in the prior 7 years. So you can also see increases happening there, although we know less about them. So these are the kinds of dynamics that I think are playing out in the speculation about, yeah. Sorry, my throat is starting to struggle, but I think we'll make it. So I'll shift now to look at New Zealand and why I think this argument also holds for New Zealand. So I'm assuming that probably most people are less familiar with New Zealand politics and foreign policy and defence policy compared to Australia. So I'll go through a bit of background. But as you would all know, there's been a lot of speculation around adding different countries to Pillar 2 of AUKUS, like Canada or Japan or New Zealand. There's been a lot of speculation in New Zealand because of this about the prospect of joining Pillar 2, even though there hasn't been any official invitation to do so. And I think the fixation on it, given the lack of a formal invitation, is quite interesting. And as with Australia, I think looking at the interests which sit behind this tell us a bit more about why it's happening. So New Zealand's only formal ally is Australia. New Zealand tends to describe its approach to the world as having an independent foreign policy, given its willingness to break with the US and Australia over matters of principle like nuclear free and the Iraq War. Before the election in October last year, at least parts of the then previous Labor government had been open to exploring Pillar 2. Pillar 1 was immediately knocked back. Not that it was ever expected to be an offer because of New Zealand's history around nuclear non-proliferation. But the previous Labor Defence Minister, Andrew Little, was a particular proponent of exploring what options might be available under AUKUS Pillar 2 for New Zealand, and he continues to be as well. However, after losing the election in October 2023, the Labor Party as a whole, under the leadership of Chris Hipkins, formally ruled out joining any pillar of AUKUS. So Chris Hipkins drew on the history of nuclear free in New Zealand to reject Pillar 1 overtly again. And he also drew on the idea of an independent foreign policy to reject Pillar 2 as well. So he said that Labor is deeply concerned about how much time and effort this government has spent getting closer to the US over the past year. Meanwhile, another Labor MP, David Parker, said that New Zealand's interests lie in trade, peace, and in ongoing diplomacy, not in being a force multiplier for one superpower in a containment strategy directed at another. So it's worth noting that opinions about AUKUS in New Zealand aren't partisan. There are former key leaders of both parties opposed. However, since winning the election, the current national-led government has become increasingly enthusiastic about AUKUS over time, particularly the Defence Minister, Judith Collins. At the same time, as in Australia, academics, journalists, and think tankers have been debating AUKUS and kind of solidified into distinct pro and anti-AUKUS camps. So those in favour will focus on things like interoperability and continued access to advanced technologies and intelligence sharing with the US and with Australia in particular. They tend to consider China a real and genuine threat, and they think that New Zealand should be showing its willingness and ability to contribute to managing that in collaboration with partners and allies. The opposition to AUKUS focuses instead on emphasising the links to Pillar 1 and the problems of nuclear non-proliferation, both to New Zealand's own personal anti-nuclear principles and to its relationships with the Pacific, if it is seen to be attached to a project which is promoting the proliferation of nuclear technologies. It's also seen as undermining New Zealand's capacity to act independently and keep the level of independence that it does have from the US. So to dig deeper, it's worth then looking at the actual material motivations for the current New Zealand government in pursuing AUKUS. Similar to Australia, we see a dual economic and strategic motivation. So perceptions of the strategic environment play a role the same way they do for Australia, but the economic motivations also come through in comments from the ministers and in briefing notes from department officials as well. It's important to note that the current government was elected in large part on a platform of cutting public spending, and this included having requested budget cuts from defence at the outset, while also talking up the need for increased defence capabilities. At the same time, like Australia, New Zealand underinvests in the research and development that the government sees as essential for economic growth. So you can see the value they place on the economic opportunities that AUKUS could provide from a briefing from defence officials to the previous government, which specifically listed the opportunities AUKUS could provide for New Zealand's research community and for its industry. And so I don't think in this context that it's a coincidence that the Defence Minister, Judith Collins, is also the Minister for Science, Innovation and Technology, as well as the Minister for Space. I think it's quite clear that she sees technology as a pathway to economic growth for New Zealand, and she's described technology and space as key areas which offer opportunities to New Zealand businesses and scientists. And it's unsurprising that she would try and make her portfolios work together in this way. It is the space industry, which is the key sector New Zealand sees that it has the potential to contribute to AUKUS. And it seems quite evident that New Zealand sees opportunities in kind of cross-subsidising its economic and strategic goals through this, hoping to achieve economic growth and new technological achievements and new defence capabilities, all at the same time, while investing as little as possible in any of them. And so you can see this here from Judith Collins' statement, which was made following a meeting between the Australian and New Zealand Defence and Foreign Ministers. So she said that New Zealand has welcomed Pillar 2, and like Australia, we believe it will make a significant contribution towards security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. I believe it is possible the hardworking and innovative Kiwis who work in the New Zealand Defence Force and in the space, technology and academic sectors could potentially contribute to the development of Pillar 2 technologies with their scientific and technical knowledge. So once again, you see the dual strategic and economic motivations coming through. There's also a ministerial briefing from September of last year, which talked about the potential risks of not participating in AUKUS Pillar 2, and alongside the traditional concerns of their relationships with close partners and allies, interoperability, access to technology, they also included the economic impact of not participating, including supply chain access. So a lot of the opposition to New Zealand joining Pillar 2 within New Zealand is focused on the fact that it may, by extension, involve New Zealand in Pillar 1, kind of implicitly. But I think it's important to focus instead on the broader suite of military cooperation under Pillar 2 and beyond, and the implications of that as well. So as with the militarisation of Australia's north, even outside specific projects, even outside specific AUKUS projects, Australia has tied itself to the US. And this is happening to New Zealand as well, partly through intelligence and military cooperation, which New Zealand has long been involved in. In some senses, it's an almost academic question whether New Zealand would join AUKUS Pillar 2 because this cooperation is already happening anyway. There is an aid memoir which was provided in response to a Freedom of Information request, asking for a briefing on what New Zealand agencies knew about AUKUS Pillar 2, where they do point this out themselves. So they argue, kind of, don't worry about AUKUS. New Zealand already has these existing arrangements through the Technical Cooperation Program, for instance, which is comprised of the Five Eyes states. And at the same time, New Zealand has also been expanding its space-based cooperation as a partner in the US. That New Zealand has been involved in a number of space-related projects, particularly in partnership with the US. Also commercially through Rocket Lab's contracts with the Pentagon and US military contractors. Judith Collins has been working really hard to sell New Zealand as a good location for satellite launches and for space cooperation. New Zealand has been increasingly involved in the US Space Force. One of the reporters from Radio New Zealand, Phil Pennington, has been reporting on this quite extensively and tracing it over time. So New Zealand has set up a satellite monitoring hub in Auckland. They have sent New Zealand Defence Force analysts to look at missions in LA and to be involved in classified space war games in Alabama as well. And as Phil points out in his reporting, while the debate about Pillar 2 in New Zealand continues, New Zealand has just been pursuing this cooperation in dual-use space technology anyway, even though New Zealand has been described as kind of being in a holding pattern with regards to Pillar 2 in an official sense. All of this cooperation on advanced technologies, particularly in the space area, is expanding anyway. And beyond just AUKUS, New Zealand is also aiming to deepen its interoperability and cooperation with Australia, as outlined in its recent 2025 Defence Capability Plan. And then if Australia is focusing energy on interoperability with the US, this by extension means that New Zealand deepening trans-Tasman cooperation plugs New Zealand into a lot of these US systems anyway. Even in terms of the US, just today, the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, was speaking from a trip he's been on within the US and the Pacific, talking about how New Zealand has been a long advocate for an active and engaged United States in the Indo-Pacific. He's been arguing that New Zealand's partnership with the US remains really strong and important, particularly when seen in the light of joint interests in the Pacific. So again, despite the chaos of the US at the moment, despite this kind of long holding pattern with regards to formal participation in AUKUS Pillar 2, New Zealand is expanding and deepening its defence and security ties with both Australia and the US. So as with Australia, I think this highlights the importance of not getting bogged down too much specifically in the debate around AUKUS. I think it's better to focus on militarisation more broadly, to look at what cooperation is actually happening on the ground, who's involved, and kind of how is it playing out. I don't think AUKUS was intended as a distraction, but in some ways it is functioning as one for both Australia and New Zealand. It's diverting attention from focusing on the conditions which created AUKUS in the first place. AUKUS is just a symptom of militarisation and of certain economic, political and security interests. And I think we need to be looking at these in a much broader and more holistic way. So in terms of contesting AUKUS and contesting militarisation more broadly, I think it's really important to trace who are the interests involved, who is AUKUS for, who is militarisation for. This then allows us to understand the motivations at play and to anticipate developments as well. I think I'm probably running out of time, but I also just had one quick side note to end on before concluding. Another reason why I think AUKUS is only one small slice of a bigger problem with the US alliance. Another piece of this puzzle is reliance on US big tech. So just to go on a bit of a tangent to look at one of the interests and actors involved in broader militarization. The reliance on US big tech and the role of Silicon Valley in the current US administration is something worth considering. And just one example to demonstrate this is that even before Trump was threatening to annex Canada, Canada was increasingly worried that its lack of digital infrastructure for intelligence storage compared to the US, UK, and Australia would have implications for it accessing Five Eyes intelligence and for being able to operate its defense capabilities. They hadn't done this digital infrastructure upgrade due to concerns about sovereignty and control over Canadian data and the implications of relying on a foreign company like Amazon Web Services, which is what Australia and the UK have done. And these are concerns that Canadians had before they were being actively threatened by the US. Reliance on US big tech in the context where the US is an overtly expansionist power and large chunks of Silicon Valley are playing significant roles within government makes this an even more concerning picture. So I think this is just a bit of a side note to end on, that this is just another piece of the puzzle why AUKUS is the least of our worries. We're tied to the US through the militarization of Australia's north, through intelligence sharing, through reliance on the US for many of Australia's existing defense capabilities, and through reliance on US big tech for much of our day-to-day lives and also government operations. So AUKUS is only one piece of the bigger picture. So to kind of bring this all together to finish up, what does this account of AUKUS actually tell us? So I think to understand how it's playing out, look at the interests involved, who's benefiting, and what new interest groups are forming as a result of AUKUS. As a second note, I think the militarized neoliberalism explanation tells us that separating the economic and security imperatives is really difficult because they are increasingly overlapping. So I think, for instance, Australian politicians currently trying to argue that they can separate their response to US tariffs and the US alliance. I think they'll find that more difficult than they might hope. And this underscores, I think, the need to more fundamentally rethink the US alliance more broadly, to start seriously thinking of the US as more of a source of insecurity than protection. This has been true in a lot of ways globally for a long time, but it's also now true for Australia as well, even in terms of very narrow understandings of what security is and how to achieve it. And to finish, if you are concerned about the role of the US in the world and Australia's place within that world, we need to look beyond AUKUS because it is the least of our worries. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think so many of us on the call who remained are probably trying to get our head around the broad-ranging implications that you've outlined. And I just want to thank you for such an insightful and multi-layered presentation there, particularly with the follow-on points and questions, suggestions for questions that we should be asking. I've got quite a few questions in the chat already, and you can probably see them as well. So everyone, you could, I think there's also a Q&A section. I will, I think everyone's adding their questions in chat, so we'll go through those. There is a question about how our own universities are implicated. Do you want to take that question, Sian?
Yes, in Monash specifically.
Yeah.
I would have to look it up to find the specifics, but I think all universities have some form of defense cooperation where they're working on either government defense grants or they have links to industry. So yeah, to find Monash specifically, I'd have to do some digging, but it would definitely be in there.
Absolutely. I think there have been a few announcements on LinkedIn, if you'd like to look on there, where our VC has firmly committed the university to AUKUS. And actually, the language that she uses is very, very similar to what you've analysed, which is, emphasising capabilities, being committed to security and so on. There's another question in there about, and I'll read it out loud for everyone in case you can't see it. The US recently cut funding joint projects with Australian universities, Monash included, that had a dimension of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Did or will Australia respond to this defunding? Do you think that the new political changes in the US under the new government, such as increased perceived imperialism or racism, will lead to Australia to revisit its commitments to AUKUS? That's a great question. In other words, does the undermining of these social values and social goals force Australia into or the policymakers who are really advocating for AUKUS, will it cause them to reconsider their position on AUKUS?
To be honest, I'm not hopeful that it will. It certainly hasn't so far. You've seen a lot of statements in recent days about how supportive Albanese and Dutton in particular of AUKUS. And obviously, even if they wanted to, neither of them would be opening that can of worms during an election campaign. But I think it is also worth considering the extent to which Australian politicians have tied themselves to the US, that they see this particular picture of the world, of the US-led global order, as being a good thing in Australia's interests. And that's a really long-standing way of thinking that they've held for many years. I don't see it changing easily, even despite these really dramatic changes in the actual US. I think there's a kind of a mismatch between what they hope the US is and what the US actually is, particularly at the moment. And I think, to be honest, I don't have a lot of hope that policymakers aren't just waiting it out and hoping for the best and kind of just hoping it will disappear and everything will go back to the way it was. So yeah, I'm not hopeful.
Thank you. I think many of us will probably concur on that. There's another question here that's actually another really important one. How is militarization at the geopolitical level translating into policing and surveillance at a civilian level in Australia? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but please give it a go, Sian.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer it very well in any level of specificity, but it's a really great question, and I think it definitely is. And I think part of that is the links that we have to US big tech corporations. So it's not necessarily government engineered surveillance, if you like. It's the fact that we are being surveilled by US big tech, and that is feeding into the relationship between Silicon Valley and the US government. So there are a lot of kind of implications going on there. So I think it will have, yeah, a big effect in that sense.
Thank you. Maybe I can slightly modify that because you've pointed out that universities have become so integrated into this
Mm.
agreement, but increasingly and more broadly into this what you term the military industrial academic complex. How does it translate into policing and surveillance within universities, maybe of research or
Mm.
just basic seminars like this, maybe? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we've seen that hugely with regards to Palestine, haven't we? That a lot of universities clamping down on any form of student protest. I know a lot of people have had a lot of trouble getting seminars around Palestine to be approved by their institutions. So in that sense, it is kind of the Australian government prescribed to the US view of the world, clamping down on, yeah, academic freedom within universities for geopolitical ends. Yeah.
And if I can continue that, not necessarily on Palestine, but also on the capabilities and the human capital elements of it. I remember, so one of the reasons that I started this series was last year I was caretaking a unit called Gender and International Relations. I started to also notice the statements that were coming out of the GO8, and it really made me pause, particularly Pillar 2. And at the same time, they were introducing these things called research permits for research on what are they called? Dual use technologies. And there was also some guidance coming out about who could be employed on those projects. And so I don't know the exact details because we're not included in these broader discussions. You know, that's a whole other issue around universities and how they work. But I was really interested to know that certain people from certain countries, there may be restrictions on whether they could be recruited into working on research on sensitive projects. So are you able to comment a little bit more on that element about how it's shaping how we're working actually at a fundamental level? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's having a pretty significant impact, even just in terms of setting up incentives for what researchers can work on. So if you kind of point towards AUKUS as being a good place for academics to be doing work, there's then this push for academics with relevant expertise to attach their research to AUKUS, even if they might not want to or wouldn't have otherwise. So I think yeah, they're kind of setting this framework wherein universities are for defence, universities are for AUKUS. And this then kind of changes the incentive structure for researchers and how they work.
I'll go to another question we have in the chat and I'll come back to that point. We have a comment. Thank you, Sian. That was a brilliant talk. I concur. I was wondering whether or to what extent non-state actors outside or on the fringes of the military industrial academic complex factor into your analysis. I'm thinking here of local and transnational civil society oppositional movements and organisations and First Nations groups who oppose and are affected by the increasing militarisation of their country.
That's a really great question. It's really interesting. I haven't thought about it a lot, but what I've noticed at ANU, for instance, is that there have been a lot of student-led like movements to expose the militarization of the university, to look at particularly ties to weapons manufacturers and ties to Israel at the moment. So they've done, for instance, like walking tours of the campus, looking at different ties that there are to defense contractors. So I think there is a lot of work drawing attention to these things among non-state actors as well.
And yeah, absolutely. And to answer that question, I'm not identifying people by name because this has been recorded, but just to say that there is a really big movement that is emerging around Australia. So there's the usual. So as Sian pointed out, this is AUKUS and other such agreements, and militarization is kind of plugging into existing neoliberal structures, economic structures, but also maybe class structures if you look at political interests and so on. But similarly, there's the anti-nuclear movements, there's the women's peace movements, there's also the pro-Palestine movements and weapons, as well as some environmental movements that I think are increasingly kind of organizing around this issue as well. And I think there needs to be more work and research on that to actually answer the question. It's an emerging area. I have another question, Sian. We're coming on to 1 o'clock, and if others would like to add more questions, please do. I was particularly struck by your spatial analysis of how you categorize the US's approach to Australia. Is that your work when you said there's a northern, this is how the US categorizes the northern? Who's writing on that?
That was, I'd have to double check. It was either coming out of the Wall Street Journal
Okay.
article or it was coming out of the work of James Curran. It was one of those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what struck me when you were describing that is how this militarization and militarism is actually changing the way we actually view the country itself. So, for starters, the redefinition of the Asia Pacific or, that area as the Indo-Pacific. And now we have this kind of labeling. Oh, Australia isn't just, it's not a country made up of all of us and all the people who live here and our different state-based or local-based identities, but you also, the US has the capacity to now redefine how we see ourselves. What does that mean? I mean, if we think it through, let's say a year into the future, if things continue the way they do, we don't know the outcome of the Australian election, but let's say if we look at what's happening in the US right now, where is this going to end? Where does this lead us to? We have these 3 geographical zones, we have increasing militarization. Where do you see this going and how is it going to play out in our lives?
That's a really big question. But I think like one concerning way in which it could play out is that it's really kind of territorializing. Like Clinton Fernandez has called Australia a sub-imperial power of the US, that it's really kind of territorializing that in really physical ways, not just in terms of like defense cooperation and things like that, but now making it a really kind of physical territorial manifestation of empire in Australia in a way.
Mm.
Yeah.
And why aren't more people talking about this?
I don't know. Um, I think I like to hope that now that the US is really kind of overtly chaotic and dangerous, that it will draw more people's attention to the role that it is playing in the world and to the way in which Australia is connected through that. We'll have to wait and see if that is the case, but I think I like to hope that it will be. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone have any further questions from the chat? I feel like that was such a comprehensive analysis that you've answered a lot of the questions that I had myself and to talk to you about. Will you be putting out a paper based on this kind of structure or?
Similar. So I kind of like the basically missing out the middle bit on the political, on the military industrial academic complex. But yeah, I'm hoping to turn it into a paper, particularly the why AUKUS is the least of our worries, comparing Australia and New Zealand, because it increasingly frustrates me that opposition to AUKUS is hyper-fixated on AUKUS and not on the broader problems of the US alliance and partnership.
Mm. But can you say a little bit about that alliance? And if we were to, I think a lot of people in Australia, and this is just a general comment, find it difficult to imagine a world where that alliance is not there. They're fearful of what that would mean, I think, security-wise. What would it look like, do you think, if you can answer that? Or what are the questions we should be asking to redefine that relationship and that alliance?
Yeah, it is really hard to picture what it would look like, but I think that kind of makes it all more important to start trying and to start asking these questions. I think Australian strategic policy is really beset by a lack of imagination in thinking of alternative ways to view the world. But I think we really need to be focusing less on a militarized response to security and a lot more on developing partnerships and relationships with other countries in the region as a starting point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was such an insightful talk, and I think everyone gained a lot out of it. We've got some more words of appreciation there in the chat. Do you want to add any last thoughts or comments, Sian, before we wrap up today?
I know, just thank you so much for having me. This has been a really good opportunity to start to put all of these pieces of the puzzle together for me. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. I'm looking forward to all the future talks in the series as well.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I think there is something where we in universities are now directed to kind of chop up our lectures and have shorter sound bites and so on. I think there is real value in listening to experts. If we talked about the politics of expertise, but people who have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues and doing the research and giving them that format in a public forum as well. So again, thank you for your time. I will share some of the readings that you've already published, the work that you've already published, and I will keep everyone up to date. And thank you very much for the audience as well. The next one is coming up in May, and I will send everyone reminders for that. And that's with Tricia, who Sian has actually cited in the research, sorry, in her presentation. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.